Hey everybody, I'm ProtoDan, and I want to talk to you about the latest round of Hearthstone nerfs. Let's just get right into it, and let's start with the one everybody wants to talk about, yogg-saron. I really like the nerf. Okay, so specifically, I just like that there's another kind of state to root for Yogg. Of course, it's nice to have him reined in for competitive play. It's nice to kind of have him reined in a little bit for ladder play, even though, at the high end of ladder, we're mostly worried about Shaman. Yogg's not a big player there. But, we can see kind of the competitive problems with yogg-saron where maybe he's a little coin flippy. I don't think it's ever been as bad as people say it has been. He's a really easy thing to hate, but Brian Kibler in his recent video, before the nerfs came out, mind you, made mention of the fact that, since Blizzard is crafting an experience, that if people are not having fun with that experience, regardless of the level of balance in play, that it's important to kind of rectify that so that people have fun, and whether or not the control is being taken away from them or given to them in terms of their actual ability to win or lose, that people feel as though they have that level of control. This is something that Day9's brought up in some of his streams as well, is the idea that it's about feeling balanced as opposed to actually being mathematically balanced, because mathematical balance is very, very easy, and balancing a player experience is actually really difficult. But the extra state now that we see in terms of yogg-saron play, before it was either he did the thing he needed to do to win the game, or he didn't. Now, though, because if he bounces back to hand, dies, is silenced, or was there another way? Bounces back to hand, silence, die. I think that covers it. If he is prevented from casting more spells, and it terminates his effect. So by reaching the end of that, we can see each player, the player who plays Yogg, wanting more spells to be cast. So he's rooting for Yogg to live. He doesn't want to see a board clear until the very end of his effect. Whereas the person who's getting yogg-saron played against them absolutely wants to see something like a board clear or a badly targeted damage spell. And it makes playing yogg-saron on an empty board actually a lot worse, because anything that deals damage to a minion deals it to yogg-saron, and he's not a very healthy creature. Five health is not a lot of beef. He'll go down pretty quickly. So I think that added element, the gamble of how long into his effect yogg-saron survives, is an interesting one, and I think that'll be a lot of fun for people to see. I think it adds an extra layer of the randomness that Yogg is known for, while kind of toning him down a bit in competitive play without stripping the fun out of him. And you can compare his random effect to something like Lock and Load for hunters. Lock and Load has kind of a similar idea in that the number of spells you get out of it is dependent on the number of spells you play. So if its random effect gives you higher cost spells, it's possible that you'll kind of run out of ammunition for it faster, so that you don't get as much out of it. So that kind of pseudo-random ending to the effect is already kind of borne out in current card design. And Lock and Load actually fits into the same niche that I think Blizzard hopes yogg-saron fits into. That it's fun, that in a very niche way it can see competitive viability, but it is in no way dominant, and it doesn't really feel like a complete board flip. It has a random element that maybe you can come back with, but if you do, it isn't perceived as horribly unfair. The next change we see in the warrior class with the change to charge. And this is an interesting one, because it's not just a numbers change. It's not a mana cost change or damage change. They remove the extra to attack, they bring it down to mana cost of 1, and they make it so that it cannot attack the hero's face. I actually think this is a great one. It absolutely kills warrior OTK. And that's a little bit of a bummer. It's always sad when kind of a complete deck archetype, especially one that's not dominating the meta, gets gutted in that way. But I think OTK decks in general, even though they can be fun for the one playing them, and can even be fun for the opponent if they know what's coming, and they know what they're racing and what conditions they're trying to kind of work around, I do think that in a game like Hearthstone, where there is no opportunity for kind of off-turn counterplay, where your opponent on their turn is kind of just doing everything and you're helpless to watch it happen to you, outside of secrets, which are restrictive in their own way. But I think that in that kind of environment, OTK decks are a little bit unfun, a little bit weird. You know, I think there are more egregious examples than OTK Warrior. Like, I think Freeze Mage is probably one of the less fun decks to play around, because, you know, if they have that hand, if they just have the ice block and then the next ice block and Antonidas, and they just build kind of the Exodia hand where they can burn you from nothing, you know, that's really frustrating. And I think it's less frustrating in that for Warrior. But I think the charge changes actually kind of open up more types of archetypal play. I think now we might be able to see, maybe not at the highest levels of ladder, but I think now we could see Raging Worgen as more of a tempo play. I think that being able to put down Raging Worgen in charge on turn 4 and use it to clear 2 minions is going to be a much better, much more interesting use of Raging Worgen than just trying to assemble him into this Exodia insta-win combo. I think that about covers it. I think the idea that you can still do extremely powerful things with charge that don't necessarily result in an instant win is kind of the right niche for the card. Execute and Rockbiter. These are essentially reining in early tempo for Warrior and Shaman. Because both of them are still extremely useful in the later game. I don't think moving Execute to 2 mana is going to impact any kind of late game minion removal strategy. I think it's only going to affect the very, very early game where mana is absolutely at a premium. So, you know, you won't be able to build quite the level of board presence on turn 3 or 4 along with an Execute that you would at the 1 mana cost. But later in the game, if you're playing Control Warrior, it's not going to have any kind of effect at all. So it just slows the decks down just a little bit, and I think that's kind of what it needs. We saw earlier, before the release of Karazhan, that Warrior as a class was very dominant, although its deck types were very, very diverse. We didn't see a single archetype that completely dominated the meta, but Execute was prominent in all of them. And I think it'll still be an auto-include for the most part, but I think reining in that early game will keep it from kind of snowballing in the same way it did. In the same way, Rockbiter in no way affects Shaman's mid to late game Doomhammer plays. It's not a problem to play Rockbiter on the turn after a Doomhammer. It's not a problem to combo it on the same turn later in the game, on turn 7 or turn 9, even if you have a double Rockbiter. But it keeps that early removal just a little bit reined in, and I think that's kind of a good way to keep things from snowballing out of control. You look at streamers like Reynad, who are very focused on random effects in the very early game and the way they can snowball out. He's very worried about things like Knife Juggler and Flame Juggler, which isn't necessarily wrong. It's not a point I really need to address here, but the idea of early game plays snowballing throughout the game and kind of that level of importance of those last few bits of damage in the early game, I think that things like the Rockbiter and Execute nerf speak to that. I think that keeping those early game plays from snowballing out of control is going to have a much bigger effect on the game than you might think, and a positive effect, but it might not be something you really notice right away. I think it'll show up later in turn 7 or 8, and you would really only figure it out with some kind of statistical analysis. Next up, we've got Tuskar Totemic, also for Shaman, which is okay, because Shaman's been dominant, and you've seen the threads. It's been done to death all the ways that Shaman is dominating, and I think this move on Tuskar is a good one, because a lot like the charge change, it frees up design space. You know, Blizzard could now design 8-9 mana enormous totems. Make it into a real kind of tribal thing, something that can work with Thunderbluff in an interesting way, without risking a 3 mana card just pulling it out of nowhere. At the same time, we've already seen things with Totem Golem being as powerful as it is. That coming out of Tuskar Totemic just didn't feel good if you were playing against it. There wasn't a whole lot you could do about it, because it was split across two bodies. Something like Flame Wreath Faceless, I think gets more flack than it necessarily deserves. I think it's one body. I think that, the overload cost on turn 5 isn't insignificant. I think it does slow their game down a bit. And I think there are a lot of single creature removal options that are available to classes in terms of counterplay. And even if you have any kind of board presence going into it, going into the Shaman playing a Flame Wreath against you, I think you have an opportunity to deal with it. Tuskar Totemic, a little less so. And I think bringing it back down to basic totems is the right move. They won't be getting any surprise card draw off of it. They won't be getting an extra 4 attack from a Flame Tongue, and they won't be getting the 3/4 Totem Golem. And overall, we see with the random elements of the game just getting their variance tightened a little. It's not less random in that, like, there's still a lot of possible outcomes that you need to consider and play around, but the power level of those outcomes is being reined in. It's not completely trash to completely broken. Next up, we have the Abusive Sergeant. It seems like this nerf is based around kind of reducing the number of 2-for-1 trades that the Abusive Sergeant is capable of. And I think it does a good job of that. For those of you who aren't as familiar with theories in card games, 2-for-1 is a form of card advantage. You get to remove 2 of your opponent's cards at the cost of 1 of your own. So Abusive Sergeant's Battle Cry allows a small minion to trade into a larger minion, so that's 1. And then Abusive Sergeant's 2 attack is a pretty effective way of removing a lot of 1, 2, even some 3 drops. So in that way, Abusive Sergeant for 1 mana for 1 card can remove 2 much larger creatures, and that can be a very strong effect. It's definitely an auto-include in any kind of zoo deck, in any kind of aggressive deck, and reining in that auto-include nature without completely destroying what the card is and does is totally correct, I think. It's not something I necessarily foresaw. I didn't necessarily see Abusive Sergeant as being a problem, but Blizzard specifically brought up the idea that, this is an evergreen card. It does exist within kind of the basic and classic set, so pulling back its power a little bit to make room for expansions to be relevant in the early game is going to be really important. So I can see where they're coming from on it. It was a little bit of a surprise. I don't think it really presents a problem. It'll still see plenty of play in zoo. It'll still see plenty of play in aggro decks. It just won't be quite the powerhouse that it was, even though we don't really think of it as being a powerhouse. It's the same kind of early game snowball effect I was discussing with Execute and Rockbiter. Another nerf that took me surprise is Call of the Wild for the Hunter class. I've always thought it was a really good card. It was clearly a very strong card. When you get it played against you, it's the beginning of the end, if not the end of the end. But I never really considered it overperforming. Admittedly, I do not have access to statistics on every game of Hearthstone ever played. I'm a schlub. I've never even made it to Legend. I'm just really interested in the card game. I don't devote the level of time to it and the level of analysis to it that makes me a more consistent, higher-end player. So, take some of these opinions with a grain of salt. But when I looked at Call of the Wild, I saw essentially 3 animal companions, right? So you think to yourself, well, that's a 9 mana effect. 3 animal companions is 3 mana, 3 mana, and 3 mana. But what you lose there is the flexibility. Animal Companion is 3 mana, meaning that you can play it on turn 3. I think that 3 turn 3 plays doesn't come anywhere close to the level of power that a turn 9 play should. The time in the game in which something happens is extremely relevant. This is some of the argument I see against the nerfs on Yogg-Saron. This is something that Brian Kibler mentioned, that a turn 10 card, a 10 mana card, should be extremely powerful. That kind of late game bomb is kind of necessary to, figuring out the way a game is going to play out, and to that finality and what your end game is. And I feel the same way about Call of the Wild. I think the fact that it occurs on turn 8, like that kind of gating of power based on the mana cost, is totally appropriate. The things that would run counter to that, though, the things that would make it seem like it should be a 9 mana card, are that Animal Companion is completely random. Just because you play 3 Animal Companions doesn't mean that you're going to get one of each companion in that configuration in a consistent way. It doesn't guarantee you that it's going to get you a Huffer. I take that back. It'll probably guarantee you get 3 Huffers, and it's probably better. But statistically, I'll go with it. So after talking about the specific nerfs, we should talk about the direction that Hearthstone seems to be heading. And when that kind of discussion comes up, I see a lot of people discussing other digital games where updates might be more frequent. And I don't think that's necessarily a fair comparison, because a lot of those more frequent updates are, as Kibler mentioned in his last video, I know I reference him a lot, a lot of those updates are kind of invisible numbers changes. They're things like, damage numbers that are hidden behind an ability. And because you're dealing with abilities that deal, large numbers of damage, in the hundreds or thousands of points, and that damage is being done to health pools in the hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of points, those kind of low percentage changes are very invisible. I think that what you should be comparing Hearthstone balance changes to are things like ability or kit reworks in terms of MOBAs like League of Legends or Heroes of the Storm, or even MMOs like World of Warcraft. These are things that completely change the abilities available to a hero or champion or character, as opposed to just the damage it does or the percentage healing it does or something like that. Because when you consider the actual card that a Hearthstone card represents, the attack and health on the card aren't really at the same level of granularity as the abilities in some of these other games. They're much more akin to the types of abilities that the card has rather than a simple stat line. And when you see how often games revise those type of statistics, those types of, that level of talent and ability and character trait as opposed to just the math behind it, I think that you'll see that Hearthstone gets balanced roughly on par, on kind of the same time frame as a lot of these other games. So I think when you're comparing the frequency of updates, you're comparing the types of updates in kind of an apples and oranges sort of way that's not really meaningful to discussion. Okay, so I'm glad that they haven't implemented a ban or restricted list for this game. I'm glad that they're balancing things through these patches that kind of affect everyone equally. I know there are arguments to be made that kind of moving things to wild, or implementing the ban or restricted list, means that you don't have to change the cards and people can play the cards in the way that they've always played them, and that is a huge disadvantage that Hearthstone has over something like Magic the Gathering, where your old, completely broken cards are still printed, they still exist, you can still break them out and play them against your friends, even if they're not welcome in competitive play anymore. But I think for a game like Hearthstone that relies on having such a large player base, and relies on that large player base to expand its esports scene. The enthusiast scene very much benefits from having a large casual base, and I think keeping the rules consistent across those two types of players is really important for keeping people engaged at the level they want to be engaged. Because while it's sad that people won't be able to play with kind of the old style like yogg-saron, for example, or a 2-1 abusive sergeant, or a Warsong commander that grants charge, I think it's kind of restricted to Hearthstone's dual nature as both a card game and a digital game. Also, in light of these nerfs, despite what different forums and subreddits might have you kind of believing, depending on the state of discussion happening there, I think that these nerfs are a sign that the devs really are for lack of a better word, learning. You know, I think they've generally been pretty good throughout the run, but I think that they are getting consistently, if slowly, better at their whole deal. When you look at the current nerfs, you don't see a lot of vilification of the nerfs, right? You know, that first round that came with, well, it wasn't the first round of nerfs ever, but the more recent round of nerfs that happened alongside Whispers of the Old Gods were very, very divisive because they were pretty big nerfs. You know, the Molten Giant nerf is still being talked about today. You know, in fact, when I looked at the Blizzard post about these nerfs, discussing the Molten Giant nerf from the last round was the top post. That was what people most wanted to discuss. And I think the reason you don't see that kind of huge division on these nerfs is because they haven't printed as egregiously broken cards that needed, you know, really heavy-handed fixes recently. I think they've reined it in. I think things like Yogg took them by surprise. I think maybe what Yogg was doing didn't really show up so well in QA testing. I think they needed the enormous test bed of, you know, the Hearthstone player base as a whole to really notice what a problem that could end up being at competitive play. And I think because its problems were problems of emotional design rather than mathematical design. I think because it felt so much worse to lose to a Yogg, even though it might not necessarily radically affect the win rate of a given player or deck, I don't think they really anticipated the level to which that was going to be an issue. But mathematically, balance-wise, I think that the recent cards have been doing a pretty solid job, so they haven't needed to change as much. And you can say what you will about a 4-mana 7/7, but that was one strong tool in what ended up being a lopsidedly strong kit, and a lot of that just got reined in. So I think before you start worrying too much about the fact that they didn't nerf Flame Wreath or Tunnel Trog, let's see how the meta shakes out after these nerfs. I think removing Rockbiter as such a powerful early game tool and Tuskar as such a swing card is going to have a much bigger effect on the game than you might think. And the fact that these nerfs happened before BlizzCon, before a competitive event, and not alongside a major content release is, you know, really, I think that that's kind of affirming. They're concerned about the state of the game in a competitive sense. You know, they want the game to feel good to play. A lot of people accuse Blizzard constantly of, you know, only worrying about sales, and they're a company. They need sales. I'm not going to argue against that. It's a very high priority for them. But the fact that they were able to look beyond something that had a very immediate kind of dollar sign value, when they were going to make a change, I think that's good. I think it shows that they are genuinely interested in the state of the game beyond immediate sales figures. So this most recent round of changes, alongside the arena changes that they made, kind of alongside Karazhan, these are reasons to believe that Blizzard is consistently and level-headedly responding to community concerns, which is excellent because our community is not known for being level-headed. You can even see it in some of the conversations Ben Brode was having recently on Twitter, where some people are like, why don't you communicate more? And he's like, well, sometimes when I communicate, it goes poorly. Well, it's still your responsibility to communicate. Okay, how would you like me to communicate? And he gets a lot of conflicting answers on that. So I think the fact that they're able to still listen, regardless of how, you know, I think that their ability to talk to us could be improved. I will admit I don't know what that improvement looks like, because everybody wants something completely different. But at least their in-game responses, I think, are consistently improving and already at a pretty high level. They might not come as quickly as you would like, but I think at the level of polish that's expected in this game, they're doing a pretty good job of it. Alright, so that's my video. Like, comment, subscribe. Like, comment, subscribe.